The processor, or CPU, is the brains of the computer and does the majority of the PC's work. There are currently two major CPU makers, Intel and AMD. Intel and AMD CPUs require a motherboard made specifically for them. The processor you buy will determine the type of motherboard you need for your system. See the motherboard component lesson coming up next for more on choosing a motherboard. The design of the CPU, the process used to make it, and the operating frequency determine the performance of a CPU. The design of a CPU is made up of a countless number of features: the number of transistors used, measured in hundreds of millions, the number of CPU cores, the amount of cache built onto the chip, and many, many more. Generally, the latest CPU design will be the most advanced, but both Intel and AMD occasionally introduce a CPU design that is meant to fill a gap in performance and price left open by existing designs. CPUs with more than one core have become standard. It means there are the equivalent of 2 or more CPUs in one CPU package. This can greatly increase the performance with programs made to take advantage of more than one CPU. 2, 3, and 4-core CPUs are on the market. 6 and 8-core CPUs will come out in 2010 and 2011. Cache is a small amount of memory on the CPU itself that is very fast and used to hold small amounts of data the CPU needs often. There can be 1 to 3 levels of cache on a CPU. They are shown as level 1, level 2, and level 3. The more levels of cache and the larger each cache is, the faster the CPU can perform. Cache sizes range from 128 kilobytes to 16 megabytes. The process used to create a CPU is measured in nanometers, or nm. By shrinking the process, CPU makers can put more transistors into the same size space, making higher performing CPUs. The lower the nm, the less power the CPU consumes, and the less heat it produces per transistor. 45 nm CPUs from both AMD and Intel are on the market now. Intel introduced dual-core 32 nm CPUs in January. Intel will start shipping higher-end quad and hex or 6-core 32 nm CPUs later this year. The operating frequency is another way to measure the performance of a CPU. In the past, CPU performance was almost exclusively measured in operating frequency, or clock cycles per second. This is displayed in gigahertz. The higher the clock cycles per second, or gigahertz, the faster the processor was. CPU performance is now more accurately measured in efficiency per clock cycle. Two different CPU types, from Intel or AMD, running at the same clock speed, can perform very differently because of their design and the process used to make them. This is why you often see two CPUs running at the same gigahertz, with drastically different prices and actual performance. A quick way to identify the design and process of a CPU is to look for the CPU's code name. For example, a Core i7 920 Bloomfield running at 2.66 GHz will perform better than a Core 2 Quad Q9400 Yorkfield running at 2.66 GHz. The Core i7, codenamed Bloomfield, has an improved design with a faster connection to the rest of the system and more cache compared to the Core 2 Quad, codenamed Yorkfield. CPUs with the same codename were made using the same design and process, so the gigahertz per second is what separates their performance. Within CPUs of the same codename, there are small changes that the CPU maker introduces over time. These are called stepping and/or revisions. For the most part, these changes are not worth considering. However, there are occasionally changes made that are significant enough to warrant your attention. CPUs with a certain revision or stepping are sometimes shown to be better at overclocking. The CPU makers will not advertise this, but users and hardware reviewers who overclock CPUs on a regular basis will notice the difference in overclockability. When this happens, they will report it online or in magazines, and give instructions for identifying the improved stepping. This is done by looking for a code either on the CPU's retail box or on the chip itself. Power consumption can also be reduced with a revision or stepping. When this happens, the CPU maker will put out a slightly different model number to show the improved power efficiency. These CPUs will run cooler because of the decrease in power they need to run. This can also make the more efficient version easier to overclock. For instructions on overclocking your CPU, see the overclocking video lessons on the website. The range of performance levels are generally shown in the names of the processors. For Intel, Celeron, Pentium, and Core i3 CPUs make up the low end of performance. Core 2 Duo and Core 2 Quad make up the mid-range, and Core i5 and Core i7 are the high-end CPUs. For AMD, Sempron and Athlon CPUs are considered low-end, Phenom in the mid-range, and Phenom 2 at the high-end. CPUs start out at around $30 at the low end and go for as high as $1,000 for an extremely high-end processor. What you're paying for is performance. The more powerful the CPU, the faster your computer will be. A good rule is to buy the most powerful processor you can afford. It will provide the best experience using the system and will extend the usable life of your computer. That being said, buying the fastest processor available can be overly expensive. Look to buy a CPU a step or two below the cutting edge. So if the fastest processor is $1,000, you can buy the next slowest CPU for $700, or 2 steps down, a CPU for $400, and save some cash to buy a faster video card, more memory, or a bigger hard drive. There are CPUs well over $1,000, but these are really for bragging rights. You will pay a lot more for just a little bit more performance. The CPU also needs to be cooled. This is done using a metal heatsink attached to the top of the CPU that radiates the heat away from the processor with the help of a fan. If you buy the CPU in a retail box, it will come with a heatsink and fan. If you buy a CPU without the heatsink and fan, also known as an OEM CPU, be sure to buy a cooler that is made for your CPU and that it's capable of cooling the model of CPU you choose. If you decide to go with a third-party cooler, there are a few features to look for. One is the use of a heat pipe to help in cooling. Heat pipes are basically a tube half filled with liquid that carry heat away from the CPU so it can be dissipated. Use of copper in the cooler can help dissipate the heat further. Most coolers use aluminum and do a good job, but adding copper, which is a better conductor of heat, can help get rid of the heat a little quicker, which is better for the CPU and also means the fan on the cooler doesn't have to run as fast, which will make it quieter and extend its life. Like the computer's RAM, the CPU can often be overclocked to get some extra performance. As with overclocking the RAM, to overclock the CPU, you need to change settings in the motherboard's BIOS. This will also increase the heat from the CPU, and therefore you will need a better third-party CPU cooler. Whether or not your CPU can be overclocked and by how much depends on how much extra speed and heat it can take. There are often CPUs which are known for their overclockability. Intel's Core family is a good example. For instructions on overclocking your CPU, see the overclocking video lessons on the website. See the motherboard component lesson for more on overclocking. We recommend spending at least $150 on a CPU, and the more you spend, the happier you'll be with the performance. When you buy your processor, whether you choose an Intel or AMD processor, make sure the motherboard you buy supports the CPU. Buy the fastest processor you can afford. Consider the design of the CPU, including the number of CPU cores, cache size, and operating frequency when choosing your CPU. If you buy the heatsink and fan separate from the CPU, make sure it's made for your CPU and is rated to cool the model of the processor you choose. In the installation lessons, we'll go over how to install both Intel and AMD-made CPUs onto their motherboards and show how to attach the heatsink and fan to the motherboard.